the new alliance between India and Israel. Much distant in geography, but increasingly aligned in strategy, India and Israel have forged a new partnership strategy that raises important questions for the Middle East, for South Asia, and for the broader global order. This session will examine how this alliance has evolved, what drives it, and what its implications are for regional security, stability, and narrative building in conflict zones. To unpack this complex and timely issue, we are joined by two eminent voices. Here with us today is Ejaz Haider, a senior journalist and defense analyst, widely respected for his deep understanding of security, foreign policy, and strategic affairs in South Asia and beyond. He will be in conversation with Azad Essa, an award-winning journalist with the Middle East Eye, whose reporting focuses on international politics, media narratives, and power dynamics in conflict regions. Together, they will bring both global perspective and regional depth to a discussion that demands nuance, context, and honesty. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in giving a big round of applause to our speakers.
It's great to have everyone here. Fortunately, it's a sunny day, even though I'm a bit under the weather, so I'm kind of shivering despite being packed, but that's okay. I'm so glad to have Azad here. I did a policy program that I do for the Center for Security Strategy and Policy Research. So I did a podcast with him, which was, I think, about 7 or 8 months ago. And I came across his book, Perchance, which is kind of disappointing because one would expect this book to have had more traction in Pakistan. And the way I came across this, you're reading books, you're looking at citations, and you move from one author to multiple other authors, and if you haven't read those works, then you try and sort of find them. That's how I got Azad's book. But without further ado, I just want to say that there are 5 major takeaways, which obviously Azad is going to talk about them. He's got slides also. One is the ideological kinship between Hindutva and Zionism. So both movements seek to establish exclusive ethnic states, and they want to do this by erasing the other. And the other, in the case of India, are the Muslims. So they want to build a Hindu Rashtra. Then the Indians have, and there's a lot of evidence of that now, lots of analyses, lots of statements by Indians themselves, of using the Israeli model in occupied Kashmir. And India is actively replicating the kind of settler colonial tactics in occupied Kashmir. Then there's which actually is very, very interesting. I really found that interesting because it's so informative. The historic duplicity of India's Israel/Palestine policy. And Azad challenges the myth that India was a friend of Palestinians. And so he basically brings out the fact that there have always been two-faced policies. Then now you have the normalization and pragmatism. So essentially move away from hushed tones to open embrace, literally open embrace. If you've seen how Mr. Modi loves actually what we call in Punjabi doing the japa. And then there's the transnational lobbying. So you have the Hindutva social media platforms and handles and the Israeli, the Zionist Hasbara coming together on multiple issues that impact either the Zionist entity or India. So that's where we're going to begin, and we'll let Azad explain the book, and then we'll take the conversation further.
Good afternoon, Assalamu alaikum. Thank you so much for coming here today. Thank you to the entire team at ThinkFest as well for inviting me. To be here in Pakistan speaking about India and Israel is, to me at least, of utmost importance. Not only does it further my reputation at least in the eyes of the Indian authorities, of being Pakistani, and so showing that they run completely on disinformation. But it's also a rare and valuable opportunity to engage with you, an audience in a country that has long borne the brunt of the several enduring myths of India. Now, this is not an attempt to whitewash Pakistan's own issues, its own crimes, its own shortcomings, but rather to underline how India has benefited from a form of exceptionalism that has rendered Pakistan for many the perpetual antagonist. Now, some of this perception may have shifted since the short war in May, in which India was sort of ceremoniously brought back down to earth, literally. But a lingering image of India still persists, both among Pakistanis and as well as many parts of the globe. Slide 2, please. Slide 2, please. So here I'd like to borrow from Perry Anderson's The Indian Ideology, in which he argues that Indian nationalism presents itself as secular and pluralist, but has always been structurally dominated by upper caste Hindu power, with Hindutva representing not a rupture, but the open articulation of an impulse that was long embedded in the Indian national project. You can see the pictures that I'm showing you, like the Indian soft power, spices, cricket, Gandhi, Kama Sutra, etc. In other words, if you ask a Kashmiri or an Adivasi in central India facing state persecution, erasure, enforced disappearances, torture, the India that we see today has always been there. And it was, in fact, an entire ecosystem, of scholarship produced largely in the West, and often by upper caste Indians in particular, that allowed the idea of India to reproduce itself and take hold of global perceptions. So yes, this book is about India and Israel, but it's also about Delhi's relationship, or about what Delhi's relationship with Israel reveals about India itself. So the story of India and Israel is obviously complicated, it's layered. And for those of you who haven't read the book, I really hope you do, I want to whet your appetite by addressing 5 myths about the India-Israel relationship. And these matters are explored in detail in the book. Slide 3, please. So myth number 1, that India was historically, morally, and politically pro-Palestine. This is inaccurate. Why so? So slide 4, please. India's early posture on Palestine was driven less by principle than by Cold War strategy. Non-aligned positioning, Arab energy needs, anxieties around legitimizing partition, especially Pakistan. These are the matters that drove their foreign policy. So to be pro-Palestine was necessary to be a leader in the global south, to be the leader of the third world. It was a type of currency. In this letter to Einstein in 1947, you can note Nehru's ambiguity, right, to Einstein. He concludes, I have no doubt that the fault is not confined to one party, but that all have erred on the question of Palestine and Jewish migration and settlement in Palestine. Slide 5, please. So even if you've heard about stories of Yasser Arafat calling Indira Gandhi my sister, or of India supporting UN Resolution 3379 in the 70s, which basically described Zionism as racism at the United Nations, the reality is that India and Israel were conducting covert arms, military, and training cooperation at the very same time. Slide. Slide. But 2, the India-Israel alliance is the work of Narendra Modi and Netanyahu. This is also false. Slide. While the relationship accelerated and became public under Modi, it was laid and nurtured by the Congress government through arms purchases, intelligence cooperation between RAW and Mossad, and early diplomatic engagements. Rajiv Gandhi wanted to modernize India in the 1980s, wanted to join the global economy, and this road to Washington was through Israel. He was told that. Slide. Modi did not invent the alliance, but he only removed India's or Delhi's inhibitions. As you can see from this weapon sales graph, prior to him becoming Prime Minister in 2014. Slide. Myth number 3. India's relationship with Israel is sort of quote-unquote pragmatic. This is also inaccurate. This relationship is ideological, it's militaristic, and it's civilizational. Slide, please. Note the language of Sharon in 2003 on his visit to India, and note the language of the descriptions from Netanyahu in 2018 as well. Ancient civilizations, gaining independence in the same period, difficult challenges. These are all dog whistles for the things we all know. So this India-Israel relationship is actually not about being pragmatic. It's built around a shared logic of securitization, counterinsurgency, surveillance, and majoritarian nationalism, not merely trade or defense convenience. So what you see online today from the Indian right wing or even from mainstream Indian commentators, these sort of ideas have been drip-fed to Indians for decades, as you see. Next slide, please. So what binds India and Israel then is not just defense cooperation, but a shared worldview, one that privileges ethno-nationalist identity, elevates security above rights, slide, and recasts state violence as sort of a national necessity. Just how Israel describes its state violence with securitization. Slide. Myth number 4. Zionism and Hindutva are marginal right-wing ideologies. Next slide, please. Zionism and Hindutva are marginal right-wing ideologies that hijacked both states. Also false. Slide. Both Zionism and Hindutva are foundational to the political projects of Israel and India. Each state essentially masked its ethno-nationalist project behind the language of democracy and secularism, while structurally privileging one population and marginalizing others. As you can see, this is from a conversation in 1993, which Shimon Peres. Coincidentally, around the same time in 1993-1992, Shimon Peres was the person who also suggested to the Indian government to revoke Article 370 to fix the Kashmir problem. Slide. So what I'm trying to say is that what appears new today is not the ideology itself, but its visibility. In its place is a more explicit embrace of majoritarianism, militarization, and exclusion, revealing the continuities that had always existed beneath the surface. Slide. I know I'm moving fast, but we'll discuss some of this. So the next myth, the final one, is that Palestine and Kashmir are separate and they're not comparable. This is also false. So the argument is not that Kashmir and Palestine are the same. The book does not argue that. The histories differ. The occupations are not identical. But the methods are strikingly similar, particularly in the West Bank today. We're talking about demographic, engineering, surveillance, military occupation, collective punishment, and crucially legal exceptionalism. India and Israel learn from each other, they share technologies, and increasingly co-produce the architecture of repression. Slide. Kashmir and Palestine are also among the oldest issues at the UN. Whereas the question for people on the ground is a matter of self-determination, the occupying powers, India and Israel, have tried to recast this issue. It's a question of law and order. It's a question of terrorism. It's a matter of security necessity. Slide. And so this is my opening salvo. I want you to begin by debunking some of these myths, because these ideas have pretty much shaped how we understand India to a large extent, and it also shapes how the media have covered this issue and the reluctance to do so. It also kind of explains how India and Israel have justified the violence against Palestinians, Indian Muslims, Kashmiris, and others. And it matters because while Palestine is being treated as a laboratory, as we know, it's something of a trope now to describe it as that, India is no longer buying, or is not a customer, just a customer. It's now a partner, essentially, to this laboratory, a co-producer, and it's creating its own lab, as such. And if you need any more sort of convincing about this outsized role that India plays in subsidizing the military-industrial complex, you don't need to look further than this graphic. Thank you.
Normally, after the presentation, the moderator and the guest have a bilateral conversation, but I'm going to forgo that and go straight to the floor. You have heard what Azad has said, and you can ask him questions, but keep the questions short so that we can have as interactive a session as we possibly can with the time.
Wonderful presentation, and here I am in the present. So, thank you for bringing out this crucial insight, and I really appreciate how you have, traced the history of this issue and this alliance, this unholy alliance. But I have one disagreement. I would like to be educated over that. When you said that the alliance of India and Israel is civilizational, like how can you compare the civilization of India with that of Israel? Israel has no civilization. It has no history, right? Like Israel is nothing, right, in front of the 5,000-year-old Indian civilization. And it has produced some of the greatest minds of all times, just like Buddha, and there are so many. So how can you compare that? How do you see the word civilizational? I would like to be educated on that. Thank you.
We take 2 more questions before we go for another round. I can't see any.
I have the question regarding सर मेरा क्वेश्चन इस हवाले से है कि मिडिल ईस्ट में अगर देखा जाए तो जो इसराइल है वो आप कह सकते हैं कि रीजनल पावर बनता जा रहा है. हो सकता है कि इस वजह से जो इंडिया कह सकते हैं कि इंडिया का अलायंस जो उसके साथ बन रहा है वो इसी वजह से. व्हाट इज योर टेक रिगार्डिंग?
So एक बार दोबारा बोले because I have to translate this. इजराइल क्या बनता जा रहा है?
सर से पहले दिन एक सेशन हुआ था, उसमें सर वली नसर साहब कह रहे थे कि जो इसराइल है वो रीजनल पावर बनता जा रहा है.
वो बैठे हुए हैं वली साहब. अच्छा, ठीक है, I got that. So there's the sense that the Zionist entity has become a regional power. So how do you look at that? Another question before we...
Yes, sir.
जी.
सर मेरा नाम आरिफ मियां है. सवाल ये है कि क्या इंडिया और इसराइल के खिलाफ प्रोपेगेंडा में पहले कोई कमी देखते हैं आप?
सॉरी, क्या आपने कहा कि प्रोपेगेंडा में क्या होता है?
सर मैंने ये सवाल किया है कि क्या इसराइल और इंडिया के खिलाफ प्रोपेगेंडा में पहले कोई कमी है?
क्या चला? Propaganda. I don't really get the question, but I'm assuming that you're saying that there's a lot of propaganda against Israel. Yeah, that's my assumption. Yeah, sure.
What I want to know is that पूछना चाहता हूँ कि will they be able to achieve the Akhand Bharat and the Israeli, what they want to know, the greater Israel? That's what I'm interested in. Will they, both in alliance or whatever support they're getting from the US and etc., will they be able to achieve these two goals or not?
Okay, thank you for the questions. I'll go backwards. I think the first one, or the last one, was about, is Israel going to be able to build its larger Israel, right? They've already started doing that. So this is the larger plan. It's a 100-year-old plan, even further. We see what's happening in Syria today. We see the steps towards Lebanon as well. So I think that's a clear answer, that they are trying to do so, and they got the support to do so.
But will they be able to do that? Because in Akhand Bharat they have Afghanistan and all these countries, and they don't even have control on their own borders. The Sikkim and all that areas now also.
You mean India?
India also at Israel. Will they be able to achieve all these countries they feel they can harness, basically? Will they be able to do that or not?
So I can't say whether they're going to achieve it or not. The point is that we need to realize that this is what is on the table. It's an idea of ambition and aspiration, where they feel that India is undivided. The undivided India has to sort of come back. It kind of goes to the first question, in which the state is not being treated as a nation state as such. It's just a state. It's been treated as an idea stretched out from some mythical text in the past. And so when you have people who are running the state and pushing towards trying to expand the boundaries in that way, then of course anything is possible, unless the states around it are able to take these matters seriously. So for example, in May, when India and Pakistan went to war, there was a clear expression of wanting to expand India, to take India into Kashmir, for example, Azad Kashmir, and even to bomb Pakistan to smithereens. And this was, they got a shock that they were not able to, move forward. But obviously, in many ways, some analysts have looked at it and thought about it and said that India is trying to inch closer towards, pushing Pakistan, or pushing towards entering Pakistan, and see how far they can go. In the case of Israel, they've been doing that for the last 50, 60 years. And every 5 years or 10 years, they take a little bit more land, And India is thinking in those terms as well. I'm not sure about the question about the propaganda against India and Israel. I don't think there's enough information about what India and Israel are actually up to. On the Israeli side, you have a lot more media that comes out on social media, or TikTok, or Instagram, or the sort of the independent media outlets that tell the story. But in terms of mainstream media, the New York Times, the Washington Post, even the BBC have been very poor in narrating what Israel has been up to. And these publications have been extremely poor with regards to what, in narrating the story of what India is up to. And that has a lot to do with the perception that India is important for the West, right, in terms of its war against China. So I'm not sure if I'll answer that question correctly, but yes.
Okay, so one of the things that you talk about in the book, and which you also mentioned in the presentation, is not just the Israeli Zionist export of weapons and armaments to India, but now collaboration between, for instance, Barak 8 ground air defense system is a good example of that, which the Indians are producing at home. It's in collaboration with the Zionists. So is this something which you think is problematic for Pakistan's security?
I mean, Pakistan's security is one thing, but as a writer from South Africa, and looking at sort of like what India means for the continent, the African continent, and for many parts of the world, this type of relationship is extremely dangerous, because whereas many countries will not buy weapons from Israel openly, there's still this covert relationship that takes place between these countries. And Israel runs like a parallel kind of customs and military trade, line, basically pipeline, so that even if the country is not pro-Israel, it will still, trade with them, right, on military hardware. But this relationship with India means that India is not just, okay, so we have to go back a few decades. When India normalized ties with Israel in 1992, one of the first things that they did is that they sent over the army officials to Israel and to kind of communicate to the Israelis that we want to work with you, and kind of we want to sort of like ensure that you become a regular source of weapon production and sales. And the reason Indians moved closer to Israel so quickly in the 90s is because the Israelis promised India that they would not just sell them weapons, but they would basically grant them permission to the technology, basically. And so they will allow that to take place. So that was very different from other places, especially the US, even Russia. And so what that means is that whereas India thought that Israel was reaching out and saying, okay, we'll work with you and sort of like we'll give you the technology, what Israel was looking at from India was that they were seeing a country with such immense potential as a market, and also as a pool of labor. And so what you're seeing today is that when this genocide started, already by December 2023, the Indians were sending drones, were sending other kinds of artillery, other kinds of bombs to Israel, because Israel could not keep up with the manufacturing of the stuff that they needed. So India started helping in that way. Now, that's one thing. But the other aspect of this is that as India develops the military-industrial complex, using these Israeli weapons, it becomes a kind of conduit to other places around the world, right, who may not work with Israelis, but they work with India because India positions itself as a leader of the global south. It's sort of like still part of an online movement, part of BRICS. So it enters Africa and Latin America through that route, and then it takes Israel's weapons there. Now, the last point I make is that the Israeli weapon is not a case of just like a point and shoot or dropping something from the sky. The Israeli weapon is essentially a methodology of doing something. It's Pegasus, it's undermining rights. It's about a method of controlling people. It's surveillance regimes. So when you sell a product, you're selling an entire philosophy.
That actually reminds me of another very good book, Palestine Laboratory, which should actually be read in conjunction with your book. No, you're absolutely right. One example of India now exporting a collaborative weapon system is BrahMos, which they have exported to the Philippines, and they also have orders from certain other countries. So one of the things I want to sort of take you back to occupied Kashmir. My own experience, a brief experience of traveling from Amritsar to Jammu, staying in Jammu for about 3-4 days, and then being bused all the way to Srinagar. This was back in 2004, October. My sense was that I was traveling through an open prison, where there were elements of every possible paramilitary force that India has in occupied Kashmir. This is on top of the Rashtriya Rifles and the regular army. I want you to dwell a little on that. In terms of, for instance, we were talking the other day about they actually forcing Kashmiris to say that, this is not Islamabad, this is Anantnag. Changing the names and actually forcing people to say that, the traditional name is not the one. So, since you talked about the settler colonial tactics, let's just dwell on this aspect of how India has kind of lapped up these tactics from the Zionists.
So again, to reiterate, this is not necessarily everything that happens in Kashmir is not taken from the Zionists. Right? India has its own methodologies across the mainland, which it has imposed on the Adivasis in central India, the Assamese in the east. So they have a history of brutality. We know that also, Hyderabad had to be annexed. So it starts right at the beginning, right? So it's not a case of everything is taken from the Israelis. So we're not trying to reduce it. I'm not saying that you're doing that, but they have an entire history of doing their own thing. And one of the main things that we note that is different from the Israelis is the lack of spectacle when it comes to the Indian kind of violence in these places. So whereas when you watch what's happening in Gaza, what's happening in the West Bank, often the internet is not cut. And one of the reasons, the only thing that we can sort of ascertain or understand why this doesn't take place is because of the brazenness of the Israelis, feel that they can get away with things. Also, the confidence that they have the support. But it's also a marketing exercise for them. When they're doing something, they are marketing their weapons, marketing their methodology, and people latch onto it to buy those things. The Indians don't have that type of confidence. They want to do something in Kashmir, they cut the internet. They want to do something in Kashmir, they pick up people and check their phones. The only thing that you see in terms of a spectacle is sort of like the demolishing of homes, which has happened before, but it's kind of, in a way, arguably you could say it has accelerated since this sort of connection with the Israelis. The funny thing, or the interesting thing for me, and perhaps for the audience as well, is that when people talk about how they came to understand a place, my understanding of Palestine came through Kashmir, rather than my understanding of, my understanding of Kashmir coming through Palestine. So having been to Kashmir first and seen what you saw, sort of this heavy militarization, this kind of extreme sort of regime of surveillance, this kind of this puppet regimes, maintaining or ensuring that the local population is not able to express themselves or express their right to self-determination, kind of policing, the self-policing. I went to Palestine and then saw that. And then you notice these immense similarities, right, very easily. And what was also surprising for me was that, I was working at Al Jazeera for like 8 years, and the inability to talk about Kashmir while being able to talk about Palestine, struck me, because you had so many Indians sort of at Al Jazeera, as well as sort of like even journalists from CNN or BBC who were open to talking about the West Bank, but having a kind of a disbelief when it comes to India, because kind of stuck with like, Nehru meant this, Gandhi meant this. Now, what you're seeing is a kind of intensification now from 2019 of the separate colonial project, in which land rights have been essentially taken away, meaning that land protections rather. So Kashmir is unable to. Let me start that again. Essentially, what has happened since 2019 is that the little protections that Kashmiris had, right, with Article 35A, has been basically taken away. People can come in from any part of India and become residents, and then therefore own land. And that comes on top of the military taking large swaths of land. So already that, people think that the settler colonial project started after 2019, but large chunks of land have been essentially taken away since 47. And that now is basically, been accelerated, in which, land is now being demarcated as state land, etc.
No, that puts it in a perspective. You're right. I mean, the Indians have been extremely ruthless in the Red Corridor, for instance, and also in the Northeast. I remember reading this brilliant book by Haider, Blood on My Hand, with reference to what the Indian state has done in the Northeast. So yeah, but But here's the thing. There have been Israeli advisors in occupied Kashmir. The number of Israeli tourists in occupied Kashmir has been steadily going up. Then all these surveillance and digital technologies, the Indians have been getting this. And so from our perspective, security perspective, the presence of Israelis as contiguous to our borders is problematic. And this is one of the reasons this whole thing about Iran and the heaven forbid the possibility of state collapse through regime collapse is something which is going to be extremely problematic for Pakistan at a number of levels.
I mean, yeah, for sure. Having Israelis on your doorstep is always a problem. And one of the reasons, think about how the Israelis have essentially, again, like thinking about my background, I always think about Israel like apartheid South Africa. So apartheid South Africa was a regime that was set up and held in that form because it did a service for someone. And so it did the service for the Americans at the time as a kind of buffer against communism to the rest of the African continent. And so the apartheid regime served that purpose. And that's why South Africa and Israel continuously, had these secret ties, built the bond together. And what it did is that it continuously worked as a destabilizing force throughout Southern Africa. So it was only until Robert Mugabe becomes, president in 1980 that the South African government is able to move towards ending apartheid. Now, to turn it back to what you were saying, is that if you have Israelis on this side, right, on the Indian side, and then if you have Iran essentially, becoming completely destabilized and taken over as such, Pakistan then is itself, right? The only thing saving you is basically your thing.
No, but given your South African background, I think the audience will be very interested in knowing that there was a apartheid South Africa that was achieved by Ejaz with the Zionists, to the extent that this whole clandestine nuclear program, there is some evidence that they used the South African soil for testing. And then, of course, you see the end of apartheid. And South Africa emerges as a completely different entity in relation to the Zionists. So give us a little bit of background on that.
One of the interesting things about this South African discussion is that around this, one of my earliest sort of political memories as a kid, goes back to cricket. And essentially, Nelson Mandela is released in 1990. And the first thing that happens, especially on the sporting front, is that India ends the sanctions on South Africa. It ends the sanctions, and so the South African cricket team goes to Calcutta and plays 3 one-day internationals. And that's my first introduction to there's something happening in my home, and there's also this other thing that some kind of political concession has taken place, and therefore we are being welcomed back into the international fold. Now, when I was doing the research for the book, I found that at the same time that India was rebuilding its ties with South Africa, it had normalized ties with the Israelis, and there was no concession that took place at that time. And essentially, it kind of showed the hollowness of their foreign policy. There was an Indian writer at the time, he wrote, he said, you guys have signed on to UN Resolution 3379 in 1975, I think, that called Zionism racism. But in 1991, you have now voted for the new resolution that says that Zionism is not racism. We can scrap that. And he's like, have you discovered a new form of Zionism, right? What have you discovered here? So India basically shifted, it went 180 degrees, right? But in terms of how it's seen to the world, it was seen through the prism that, it wants to become a player in terms of, being part of the solution. Now, Parallel to that, South Africa emerges in the early 90s. It joins the global economy. It makes a lot of compromises. There's things like the Sunset Clause that takes place in around 94, in which basically means that white capital is not going to be essentially attacked, right? So you will have political rights in South Africa, but the economic control over things, of the economy, right, still in white hands, and there'll be a shift that takes place after some time. And so when you have South Africa taking Israel to the ICJ over the last 2 years, you know, the untold stories about the internal fissures and the schisms in the society. So it's not like the entire South African society is with the Palestinians. It's not as if all across the political board are with the Palestinians also. There's huge pressure to not, take Israel to the ICJ or to withdraw the case. And that stems back to the sort of like the legacy of the apartheid regime, in which there's still the sort of like movements or political parties and figures who still kind of reminisce for the past. And in fact, I wrote this piece a year and a half ago, in which if you go to a rally in South Africa, you would see so many black or mostly brown people, right, of Indian origin, and black people as well, obviously the majority, and you would hardly see white people in the crowd, because they're looking at Israel as kind of like the country we wish we still had.
That's very interesting. Do we want to have another round of questions, a couple of questions before we conclude this? You and then.
It's interesting that you talked about Israel's aspirations for a greater Israel in terms of more land that they require for reasons not explained. And then you talk about the Hindutva Indian ambitions for a greater Hindu state. Now, in the case of Israel, as you said, it's an ethnic state. With due respect, I disagree with you in the sense that my view is that Israel is essentially a national security state. While formed by the Jews for whatever reason by international power, its narrative throughout has been, for its own populist consumption, that if we are not a national security state, we're going to be threatened and we're going to be wiped out by the Arabs surrounding us all over. Therefore, for our national security, it is absolutely important that we constantly ensure that the surrounding Arab countries and the other territories that can be a possible threat to us are somehow rolled back. And that is a part of the greater Israel ambition and so on and so forth. In the case of Hindutva, the contrast is very different in the sense that India has no such national security threats from outside external powers as such. And yet you are looking at India in one of your screens here, achieving possibly Hindutva a larger state in the next 10 years. Now, given the issues that India has internally, Mizoram and Nagaland, Sikkim and all these places, I very much doubt your thesis there as to India's ability to do that in the next 10 years' time, and particularly in the context of the...
We got that.
Okay. So,
Yeah, we got that.
Now,
I just, before...
One thing, if I may add one sentence to you made a point here. I see India and Israel's collaboration more in a slightly different context, in the sense that we are part of Israel's sphere of the Arab world, and therefore, by extension, the Islamic world. They perceive Pakistan, and Netanyahu is going on record to state that, they perceive Pakistan as a threat to Israel's existence because of our nuclear capacity. Thank you.
Okay, we'll take the other two questions. You can respond to this, but I'm also going to add something to this comment.
What do you think is the role of the UAE in this alliance between India and Israel? We keep reading every so often that they're fomenting rebellion around Gwadar and other places. What is their role and how is that a threat to Pakistan?
Good question. Either someone. So this is the last question you take.
Coincidentally, I was going to ask the same thing, so by extension, that answer will cover that, but I would like to ask Ejaz to comment on the fact that with the ever clearer emerging Middle East linkage in this unholy alliance, it's already made inroads in Africa with Libya, Somaliland, Sudan, etc. How dangerous is it going to be for Pakistan, and can we do the impossible balancing act and counter it?
Thank you.
So I also realized I didn't answer the gentleman's question at the back earlier, and I think it feeds into the the last question here. The question earlier was about that Israel, didn't exist, and India has its whole history, and so how can we compare the two? India didn't exist until 947 either. India is just a state, like any other state. And all the ideas about India is a construction. And so Israel is a construction, India is also a construction. All those states within India, they're not part of India. Like, what was that? What are we talking about? So if we think about the construction of the state of Israel and the construction of the state of India, construction of any state, the idea is not that we are trying to demonize India in particular. We're trying to say that India's foreign policy was never exceptional, as they described it themselves to be. That it was pushed on an idea of a moral goodness based on Gandhi and Nehru, and being anti-colonial, and being non-violent, and all this other hubris. That the state had to be forced together, and that there was a narrative that was built around putting that state together. And that has had implications for Pakistan, in the creation of Bangladesh, for Kashmiris, for the people within India itself, that those who are not part of the Hindu upper caste minority, right? The people who are outside of that. In the last session with Sam Dalrymple, the comment was made about how during the census with the British, you had people, told that they were Hindu, and they built this false majority. So India has built on this major construction, and so I think we need to be very careful about saying, okay, Israel doesn't really exist, but India does exist. India, the greater story of the subcontinent, the civilizations that existed, they did exist, but the narrative of that belongs to one India, where there should be one language, one religion, people that fit in, and people that fit or outside that. That is all fabrication, right? And that fits into the question by the gentleman here with regards to the comparison with Israel being a security state. Why is India not considered a security state? Right? It has 500,000 to 1 million troops in Kashmir. It has built up an entire nexus with rogue authoritarian regimes from the UAE, Saudi not so much anymore, but it has continued to move towards building a militarized state in which I'm losing my train of thought here, but maybe I can start again.
To help you with your answer, in Israel's case, it is being sold as a narrative to the public that is a national security threat.
Yes, sorry, yes.
That's the point. In India's case, my point was that they do not have such external security threat. Now you can carry on.
Well, Israel wouldn't have that threat either if it was a normal place. So India is also selling that story because it's also not a normal place. It has essentially built up this narrative that we are under threat continuously. It's kind of like in a state of permanent war. It has built up that narrative. And you think about what happened in Mumbai in 2008 as well, and how, Reese McCall wrote this really good book about how when that attack takes place in Mumbai at the Taj Hotel and other parts of Mumbai, as the attack is playing out or is continuing and it hasn't been finished yet, the Israeli authorities start working with the Indians about, with regards to selling them technology to try and fix this matter. So it's really built around that. really built around building this kind of oligarchic economy as well. So yes, I mean, Israel would not have that issue. I mean, South Africa was also built up as a place that we need to, have this atom bomb and have be militarized and secure our borders because we're under threat. But then we were an apartheid government, apartheid regime, so of course you should be under threat. But the thing is that the similarity between India and Israel in this case is that India is jumping on the bandwagon of taking on this sort of this lexicon of being a civilizational project. Not that it took it from Israel, but it has basically jumped on it, taken it from its original place in the 1920s or so, and now really accelerated it.
So we basically only left for 2 minutes. Very quickly.
The UAE.
Yeah.
Sorry. The UAE question, thank you for that. The thing about the India-Israel relationship also that's very interesting is that the reason that Modi was able to move so fast is primarily because of the Abraham Accords that took place in that first term. And UAE was central to that. So when we think about India's relationship with Israel through the decades, one of the things is that India is not very original, it's not very brave when it comes to its foreign policy. It's very careful, it's very cautious. It waits for what China does, it waits for what one of the other bigger governments do with regards to issues around the world. And when it comes to Palestine, it waited until this Abraham Accords kind of takes place, so it kind of understands that there will be no blowback from the Arab world. So how can there be blowback against Delhi if UAE and, of course, Sudan and then Bahrain and Morocco, all these other countries are basically working with the Israelis? But what that means is that this relationship with the UAE has basically facilitated not just the relationship with Israel, but also the relationship with those rogue governments as well, like Morocco. So I mentioned Mumbai in 26/11 attacks. The Taj Hotel is owned by the Tata Group. The Tata Group, immediately after those attacks, start building relations with Israel. TCS, which is the Tata consultancy services, they basically do work for the Israeli military now, right? And they run like the New York Marathon and the London Marathon. And Tata Group now works with the Moroccan army by building cars for them, basically, and using Israeli technology to build those sort of like armored vehicles. So this is the sort of ecosystem that's being built with the Israelis, with the Indians and the UAE, and kind of backed by US power. So the Israelis will provide the so-called tech, right? The Indians will provide the labor and the potential market as well. And the UAE provides the capital. And the Americans provide, obviously, the protection, as I said. And you may have heard also about this IMAC, Indian Middle East Economic Corridor. And today you have India, Adani, and going back to this oligarchic sort of like economies, Adani owns the Haifa port today. And so you have this essentially India basically trying to build or trying to create a new map of trade through the UAE. And obviously they have to go to Jordan. I don't know how that's going to work yet. But basically taking your goods to the UAE, putting it on a train, and taking it all the way to UAE and maybe Saudi as well as to Jordan into Israel. Israel goes to Haifa port. From the port, you put it on a boat and it goes to the Mediterranean and goes to Europe that way. So you kind of bypass the Suez Canal. So the UAE and India and Israel are kind of very, very much connected. And it is a threat to Pakistan. It's a threat to many other places as well. And finally, to take it back to not just your self-interest or our self-interest as a global community, but the Palestinians in all of this are the biggest losers. Because once you build an ecosystem in which UAE is now investing in India, Indians investing in Israel, the Israelis investing in the UAE, you create an unbreakable sort of ecosystem. How do you address Israel when you have to address India? How do you address India? You have to address the UAE, right? In the meantime, global capital and goods just continue to flow, right, to that port, as a metaphor. And the Palestinian cause basically gets pushed aside.
So, that was the map that Netanyahu brandished in September 2023 at the United Nations, that IMEC thing. Also part of the Eretz Israel bullcrap that they keep talking about. I'm happy with this. As a matter of fact, there's got to be a distinction between the UAE as a collection and Abu Dhabi, which takes the lead and which is the prime mover of taking this whole thing about being little Sparta rather seriously. We can talk about that. I started talking about 3 years ago and no one listened, but now everyone is aware of what's happening and how Abu Dhabi has been batting for the Zionist entity and for what reason. And very quickly, except those states which, according to Mike Carney, were living a pleasant fiction because someone else was providing the umbrella. So every state. Having said that, I would request that you read the revisionist Zionist historians like Benny Morris et al., which will give you a sense of how, from the get-go, the idea of the Zionists was to come, expel and exterminate the Palestinians. So it's not that the Palestinians call it. If you read the 2 essays by Zeev Jabotinsky, the Iron Wall 1, Iron Wall 2, if you read what Ben-Gurion wrote about if you read what Chaim Weizmann wrote about how they're going to exterminate the Palestinians, you would understand what the entire game plan was from the word go. But anyway, it's a long discussion. Let's give a big hand to Azad Essa. Thank you, Azad. That was good.
Thank you very much.